Anesthesiologists, what are the best things people have said under the gas? Might be late, but I have a story. I got my wisdom teeth removed at 16. I grew up in a small, remote, white Canadian town. We had to travel to a slightly larger, slightly less remote town to visit the hospital there for the procedure. The new anesthesiologist there was a very nice Chinese doctor whose family had just moved up from the city. Now, and this is important later, I had just returned from a year away. I spent a year of high school as an exchange student in Taiwan and had only gotten back a few weeks earlier. Procedure happens. Nothing major goes wrong, and I come to in a hospital room in a fair bit of pain but mostly fine. My dad had driven me to the hospital and came in to see me and get me up to take me home. The minute he saw me, he burst into a laughing fit, and I could tell from his face that he'd been laughing about as hard as anyone could laugh. Once he finally found his composure, he explained to me what had happened. The anesthesiologist and a nurse came out into the waiting room after I was put under and apparently were white as ghosts. My dad asked if anything was wrong, and eventually the anesthesiologist, still in a daze, explained to my dad that after he administered the anesthesia but before I was fully out of it I began speaking to him in fluent Mandarin, and that he thought maybe he needed to call someone to ask how it's possible that this redneck white teenager could suddenly gain the ability to speak Chinese under anesthesia. Needless to say, my dad thought this was hilarious and explained to the doctor's relief that the white kid did already know how to speak Mandarin and that he hadn't damaged my brain somehow. I had a patient coming out of anesthesia who opened his eyes as I was switching him from a mask to nasal cannula tell me this hospital has the most beautiful women I've ever seen. Made me blush, I was so flattered, and made the rest of my day awkward with my co-workers teasing me about it. Whoever you, a sleepy man, I simultaneously thank you and hate you. Two of my favorite. Both patients coming out of anesthesia. Am I in hell? I responded, no you're not. You're just in recovery. That sounds like something the devil would say. Count backwards from 100 to prove it. Or the one who stroked my unshaven arm while I was trying to keep him from pulling at his IV, and muttered you'd make such a great carpet. I love the implication that the devil can't count backwards. I was given a relaxer prior to colonoscopy and was rolled into the room. Doctor asked me what I had done that weekend. I said I went to the MN State Fair. Oh, she says eat anything interesting. I said why don't you tell me? No laughter whatever in the room. And then I was out. I swear she gave an extra shove because I half woke up during the procedure and remember groaning. Not an anesthesiologist. But when I severely dislocated and broke my knee, I apparently gave one of the doctors that was just finishing resetting my leg a huge slap on the back and yelled it's fixed. You guys are the best doctors I've ever seen. Giving a 5-star review. Wife said the nurses were cracking up. I'm a pretty big guy and the doctor I gave the friendly pat on the back was a relatively small dude. I broke my hand tumbling once and had to get surgery. He goes to put the mask on my face and says this is oxygen. I cough as the mask goes on. He pulls the mask away and I said I trusted you. You lying f***. That's the last thing I remember. After getting my wisdom teeth removed I looked at my mother-in-law and said, how did you get on my rocket ship? When I was about to go out for surgery, they were strapping me down, and told me it was so that I don't fall off the table. My last words were, it's okay, 5-second rule. My wife couldn't take me for my first colonoscopy due to work, so my mother did. And apparently coming out of anesthesia, when they were removing my IV, I told the nurse, oh, that's neat. I've taken a lot of those out, but I've never had it done to me, and my patients are always dead. Apparently she looked very concerned by this information, and my mother had to explain that I've been a licensed funeral director for many years and hospitals and other facilities often do not remove tubing. Apparently I then followed that up by telling the young nurse she had a nice but not as nice as my wife's. My mother felt free to share that with everyone. So yeah, I creeped out a nurse by talking about my occupation, and then even more by commenting on her in a backhanded compliment. I was also briefly a mortuary student, and got my wisdom teeth out immediately before I was to set off for my embalming practicals, like I flew out the very next day. So I'm in the doctors with my mom, Who is asking if I can still fly right after surgery, and should I be away for 14 days right afterward? Before the dentist even has a second to respond, I just yelled at the top of my lungs, "You can't keep me away, my dead people need me, you're not the boss of me," then passed right on out. Not an anesthesiologist, but as I was going under for my shoulder recon, I realized the surgeons were blasting Back in Black by AC/DC, and I said, "Hey, is that AC/DC?" Super confused, thought I lost the plot, and the surgeon comes over me, face mask and surgical goggles on, looks me dead in the eye and says, "Of course, what else are we going to rock out to while we operate?" 1 second later I passed out. I was coming out of general anesthesia after a surgery to repair a broken leg. I woke up in my room with about a dozen very caring, kind friends and relatives who had all come to see that I was okay. I looked around, saw everyone giving shit about me, said this loudly and very clearly, and went right back to sleep. My friends thought it was hilarious. My mom was mortified. Similar story. I was coming out of general anesthesia for an emergency appendectomy. Woke up. My family was all in the room. Remember feeling warm fuzzies that they were so concerned for me, and thought I just dozed back off. Turns out, I woke up, surveyed them, locked eyes with my mom, and said, "I told you I didn't just have menstrual cramps," then passed back out, with a smug look on my face. Happened today. Patient has a broken ankle fixed and was coming out of anesthesia when he was being wheeled out. The anesthesiologist accidentally hit the door frame on the way out. Patient: "Did you just do surgery on my leg?" Anesthesiologist: "Yes, you had surgery and are waking up from it." Patient: "Then why are you running into things?" Not an anesthesiologist, but my husband kept telling the medical staff after his procedure that it's okay. "My wife's a doctor. She knows what you're talking about. I'm a lawyer." I was about to be put under for a colonoscopy while the nurse was trying to position me in a way to make it easiest for them to work. I had my knees to my chest and was passing out from the gas when I asked the nurse to paint me like one of her French girls. Then passed out. Still makes me cringe. I went under for a nasal canal surgery, and apparently after the surgery I was holding the nurse's hand and repeating, "I love you. Don't leave me," over and over. My anesthesiologist tried to calm me down with a joke when I was a little kid being put under. My mom later told me about how I apparently commented on the joke being not at all funny and how I hoped he was more talented as a doctor. Last year they were knocking me out for a colonoscopy. It was the 3rd time I had been put under in a year. As such, I had a curiosity. I had heard that when they knock you out you are still awake for a while. You just don't remember. So in the spirit of science I proposed a test with the anesthesiologist. When she started the medicine I would begin counting backward. When I would wake up we would compare what I remembered to what she observed. Plunger down 99, 98, 97. I remembered nothing more. Minutes later I awoke. The anesthesiologist espied me and came over quickly. "What did you remember?" she asked. 97. She began laughing. "You got down to 7. In high school I had a reconstructive surgery on my knee as I tore my ACL and meniscus in a sports injury. After the surgery I woke up in post-op, which was a fairly large room with probably 6 to 7 other patients in beds waiting to become conscious again. I was lying there all groggy and confused when 2 nurses walked over pushing one of those carts with a computer on it. They stood over me and were typing into the computer when one nurse said to the other in a sort of frantic whisper, "We've got to plug this thing in or this one is going to die." Naturally, semi-conscious me thought that the thing was me, and I started to incoherently yell for the nurses to unplug whatever they needed to in order to find an outlet to keep me alive. Turns out it was the battery on the laptop that was going to die. Apparently the death rate for an ACL repair is pretty low. Not anesthesia, but patient was heavily sedated in ICU. Nurse gave an enema. Half-conscious response: "Honey, you know I don't like it that way." I'm an anesthesiologist. I was recently taking care of a 17-year-old kid and he looks at me and says, "Dude, I am high as f***." They almost never remember it afterward. Anesthesiologist here. I was once transporting a patient to the ICU after surgery, in which he got some ketamine, and he was rocking out the entire way there with his air guitar. My husband went under last year, and once he woke up, by our appearances he was as sober as a church mouse. walking, asking serious questions of the doctor. Apparently no issues at all. He remembered the procedure and described it to me in detail. I figured he just never went completely under. He was craving Chinese food, and nothing would do except for buffet. So we headed down and loaded up our first load of plates. Evidently, he actually woke up from the anesthesia at the buffet. As far as he remembers, he was put under and woke up in front of a plate of chicken teriyaki on a stick. Not an anesthesiologist but was a tech. Had a patient wake up violently. When he came to, he said, "Sorry, I thought I was a shark." My wife is an anesthesiologist. When she was in fellowship, she had a patient say they saw dripping off the ceiling ketamine infusion. As someone who gets those medically, can totally see this happening. 100% yes. I've had them for pain, and dripping off the ceiling isn't even the weirdest thing I've seen. Pokemon performing surgery on stars is probably weirder. And yes, that happened, to my eyes, while doing a ketamine infusion.